Looks like we have a small group so far, but hopefully others will join as we get underway. But first of all, thank you everybody for joining us for this REL Pacific webinar, Early Reading Outcomes in the Pacific Region, a focus on English learners. My name is Kirsten Miller. I'm a communications manager at REL Pacific, and I will be your facilitator today. I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Domino, who's a senior research associate at the Instructional Research Group, and my colleague, Erin D'Amelio, who is a research associate here at REL Pacific. I also want to mention that my colleague, Betsy Calloway, will be our technical facilitator today. She's not up on that screen, but she's online to help you with any issues you might have with your audio, or if you have questions about any of the functions of Zoom. Please feel free to send Betsy a note in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get you squared away. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. If you haven't attended a webinar using Zoom before, it's a little bit different than some other platforms that you might be familiar with, like Adobe Connect. It's a little less formal, and it has fewer restrictions on participant access. So it's easier to run into technical difficulties when people are clicking around. It's really easy to gain control of my screen, for example, which probably none of us want that to happen. So we'd like to ask you to limit yourself just to the chat box on those commands on your toolbar there. So let me briefly introduce Joe and Erin and tell you a little bit about REL Pacific before we jump into our content. Dr. Joseph Domino has had experience as a general education teacher, a special education teacher, an administrator, a behavior consultant, and a researcher. He has extensive research experience as a principal investigator and a co-principal investigator, and in developing and providing professional development to educators kind of across the gamut, to teachers, administrators, instructional assistants, and parents. And that he's done that in the areas of early reading intervention, vocabulary instruction, reading comprehension strategies, and classroom and behavior management. And he's also been a panel member on a number of What Works Clearinghouse practice guides, one of which we'll be discussing today, and consults nationally in the areas of early literacy and reading comprehension, vocabulary instruction, and presents quite a bit at state, national, and international conferences. He's also published in numerous peer-reviewed scholarly journals that include American Education Research Journal, Exceptional Children, Reading Research Quarterly, and many more. So as you can imagine, we're very happy to have him with us today to talk to us about early literacy for English learners. And my colleague, Erin D'Amelio, is also with us today, is a research associate at REL Pacific and supports our partnerships and through training and technical support on the REL Pacific contract. She has experience in qualitative and quantitative research in literacy and international education issues, and spent 2 years teaching English as a second language in Malaysia and France. So as Joe talks about the recommendations from the practice guide, Erin's going to contextualize those for us for the Pacific context. Next, I'd like to take a moment to tell you just a little bit about REL Pacific and our work in case you're not familiar with us yet. REL Pacific at McREL is one of 10 regional educational laboratories, or RELs, that are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. We serve educators in the state of Hawaii, in 3 U.S. territories, which are American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and 3 independent nations in free association with the U.S., which includes the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, which includes Kosrae, Pohnpei, Chuuk, and Yap, and also the Republic of Palau. So we work with research practice partnerships in these jurisdictions. We focus primarily on 4 priority areas, and those are college and career readiness and success. So that's all about aligning system expectations for K-12 graduates with entry into college and the workforce. Professional learning, which focuses on collaborating with teachers and system leaders to create a professional learning environment in which teacher development is actually welcomed and it works. And then early learning and early literacy, which we're focusing on today, which is about developing language skills and literacy goals in multilingual contexts for early elementary students. And then Pacific cultures and education kind of underlies all of the support that we provide to education stakeholders in the Pacific. So namely, it's really about integrating and cultivating local cultures and how that's central to students' education outcomes and system improvement efforts. And then finally, before I turn this over to Joe, just one word about our goals for today. So we have 2 primary goals. And the first is really just to present two of the recommendations that appear in the Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners Practice Guide. And then, as I mentioned, to contextualize that information to the Pacific region. If you're not from the Pacific, but you work in a diverse context, these tips will be useful for you too. You can go ahead and adapt the information that we present to you today for whatever your unique context is. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Joe, and let me just give him control of my mouse and keyboard. And Joe, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Okay, I'm ready. This is the cover to the practice guide. So this is the website where you can download the practice guide, and as you can print them out, you can do whatever you want with them, but it's totally free. Okay, and we could move on to the next slide. So as Kirsten said, we're going to be talking about 2 of the 4 recommendations, one on vocabulary and one on oral and written language, English language instruction in the content areas. But what I want to point out here is you'll notice that there are levels of evidence for each recommendation. And the levels of evidence are explained in the practice guide. But what I want to call to your attention is number 3 about writing written skills. You'll notice that it has a minimal level of evidence, and what I want to bring home to you today is that what that means is that the panel couldn't point to a body of research that demonstrates positive effects on students. So it doesn't mean, minimal evidence doesn't mean that the recommendation is less important than the others, because you all know writing, we want to teach our students how to write. And so it's just that there isn't enough research out there to give it a higher level of evidence. So I always like to call that to folks' attention so that they won't say, oh, you know, that's minimal. I think I'll just skip that one. Okay, so moving on. We're going to talk about recommendation 1, and this has strong evidence. We're going to teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities. Okay, next slide. So each recommendation has what we call how-to steps. So that if you follow these steps, you'll be able to address the major recommendations. So that recommendation 1 is kind of like the umbrella, and your how-to steps are below. So for how-to step 1 is choose a brief, engaging piece of informational text that includes academic vocabulary as a platform for intensive academic vocabulary instruction. Now, before I go into the criteria and talk about them for a minute, I know that in a lot of places you have to use the textbook that the state or the government or whatever recommends, and there, you know, there are committees and they recommend this textbook or that textbook, and so I understand that maybe you don't have a choice in your textbooks, but when you're choosing text to supplement the textbook, particularly in the area of history, these criteria, you know, will help you choose something to kind of enhance what your textbook is telling you. A lot of times, particularly in history, it's very cursory. The explanations are very cursory, and the kids don't quite get the understanding of why one thing led to another in any history that you're studying. So let's move on to the next slide and look at the first 3 criteria. So the first is that you want something that's brief, interesting, and engaging. You don't want something too long because it can be intimidating to students, and so you want to find something that's content rich. And you know, the practice guide is a few years old, and it talks about magazines and newspapers and letters to the other editor and things like that. But you know, now the internet has just exploded. So you'll be able to find so many interesting things on the internet. So don't forget that. And of course, you know, if you find an interesting article in your newspaper, that's cool too. The second one is it contains a variety of target academic words to focus on. So you want to make sure that, that there are some challenging words in there, because remember, our goal is to increase our students' vocabulary knowledge. So you don't really want a piece of text that is too easy, or a piece of text that just has, you know, all the words that they can understand. Okay, so you want to have a little bit challenging so that you can teach them some new vocabulary. And then, of course, the third one makes sense, that, you know, you want it to build on the student's knowledge of the topic that's at hand. Okay. Okay, the next slide, we have a couple more here. Provides sufficient detail and examples for students to be able to comprehend the passage. So, as I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, a lot of times textbooks don't make those connections between and among, particularly events in history. And years ago, Isabel Beck did a really nice article, and she analyzed American history text. And it's a fascinating read to see how these textbooks are written, and they're not written very well. So when you find a text that you want to supplement whatever you're teaching, you want to make sure that has details and examples, and it makes connections between and amongst concepts, and that they're clear and unambiguous. And then the number 5 contains ideas that can be discussed from a variety of perspectives. Now, this is important because if you have a piece of text that you can talk about from a variety of perspectives, can you imagine how kids will be able to talk about it? Because remember, if we're going to increase English language proficiency, you have to talk. I mean, if you want to learn how to play the violin, you got to practice. So if you have something that's a variety of perspectives, then you have kids that can talk about it, and also they can write about it. So now I'm going to turn over to Erin, and she's going to talk to you about the next couple of slides.
Hi, everybody. So the guide has a lot of great resources and examples that include passages related to a zoo, for example. It's likely, as Joe mentioned, that some of the texts that teachers have won't necessarily be relevant or maybe interesting to students, but they can choose a lot of different supplemental works or passages. And so we decided that this one might be a relevant and engaging topic for students in the Pacific to look at, because studies do show that students may prefer to read stories about their own cultures rather than ones they can't necessarily connect to. So, for example, this one is talking about climate change and how it will affect Pacific islands. And as Joe suggested, the type texts like these can be connected across content areas and can be discussed from a variety of perspectives. And though this differs from the guide's example, it still uses the same criteria and principles that Joe just presented on. Again, you can see here that this talks about the impact of climate change, and we can see that it's talking about a recent study. And let's see, Kirsten, I think I'm having the same trouble as Joe here with moving the slides forward.
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump back in and just move all of these. There we go.
Right, so as you can see, the passage is relatively short, but it does cover and include a lot of different vocabulary words that students can use and teachers can take advantage of for their lessons. So now Joe will talk about step 2 for recommendation 1.
Okay, thanks. All right, so step 2 is to choose a small set of academic vocabulary for in-depth instruction. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to start with 3 here. You want to choose words that are central to understanding the text. And what we like to call them in our research is they're conceptually central to understanding and comprehending the text. And one thing that we're all used to, I taught for many years, is textbook publishers put words in bold that they feel are important vocabulary words that need to be taught. And just a cautionary tale is that sometimes those words, they're not conceptually central and they don't need to be taught, or they may be words that your students already know. So you may just want to review them rather than teach them in depth. The second one is that words that are frequently used in the text. So this is important because if they're frequently used in the text, it's probably an important conceptually essential word, and so students really need to know what it means so they can understand what they're reading. And they will also have multiple opportunities to encounter that word as they read through the text. And then another one is words that might appear in other content areas. Isabel Beck, who is, to me, the vocabulary guru, she coined the tiers 1, 2, and 3 when it comes to words. And tier 1 are words like table and chair and things like that, which really for most children don't have to be taught. And then your tier 2 words are words that go across content areas or across domains. So words like fortunate, convenient, analyze, persistence, those are words that could appear across content areas. So when you're looking to teach the words, you want to kind of look out for those tier 2 words. And we're going to talk a little bit more at the end, a couple slides there, a little bit more on tier 2 and tier 3 words, because tier 3 words are words that are to a specific domain, math, science, etc. Okay. Okay, the next slide. Words with multiple meanings. So these can be useful across domains. For example, volume in science or math refers to the space that an object occupies. Well, in English and language arts, it could mean a series of books. So one thing when you're working with English learners, you want to make sure that you are that you're going to focus first on the meaning of the word for the text you're using. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're teaching science and you're talking about conductors. Certain materials conduct better than others. I'm not a scientist, obviously, from my explanation. But anyway, so if you're talking about conductors in science, you want to make sure you teach that well and they're firm on that they understand it. Then it would be good to clear up a little, maybe some confusion that the students might associate conductor with an orchestra, or they might associate it with, a train. Okay, so you want to make sure that the primary reason you're teaching that word for the science comes first, and then you can talk about the other ones to kind of clear up if there are some problems. And then the next one is words with affixes. So, for example, if you add the prefix "un" to the word fortunate, it gives you an instant antonym, since "un" means not. So we're going to talk just coming up in the next little bit here, we're going to talk about how to use prefixes and suffixes and root words to figure out the meaning of words. But the words with affixes, they're really rich in teaching opportunities. And then, of course, there's the cross-language potential, and we call those cognates. Now, in the research we do, most of our English learners Spanish is their primary language. So a cognate is a word that sounds, in English and let's say Spanish, sounds similar. And they mean similar. There are some false cognates. So for example, scientific in Spanish, and I'm going to apologize for my horrible accent, is científico. Okay, so they mean the same, they sound the same, and so you can use that knowledge that the student, you know, if you think the student has that word in their primary language, then you can use that word to help teach the word and the understanding of the word in English. Okay, and if you go onto the website, you can find a lot of information about cognates in the different languages and things like that. Okay, so we're going to go on, and I'm going to toss this over to Erin again.
Thanks, Joe. So cognates, just to piggyback on that, may not necessarily be the most relevant for Pacific languages, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist at all. But this is just an important thing to keep in mind that could be useful when teaching students some vocabulary words. So going back to that passage I shared a little bit earlier, we pulled out a couple of words just to demonstrate what Joe just presented. So we have 4 vocabulary words: uninhabitable, impact, overwash, and primary. So let's go to the next slide and look at uninhabitable. It is crucial for understanding the text. It also appears multiple times throughout the passage. So if a student doesn't understand this word, then they're going to have a hard time reading the entire passage. Additionally, its roots and habit can have different affixes that teachers, you guys, can show students how word parts change its meaning or its grammatical form. So for example, adding ANTS changes inhabit, a verb, to inhabitants, a noun. So this is one example of a rich word to take advantage of. In the next slide, we'll talk about impact. Like uninhabitable, it is also important to understanding the text, and it can also appear in many content areas, such as in science, for example, the impact of the moon on tides, or history, for example, the impact of economic laws on unemployment rates. In the next slide, we have what that would call a tier 3 word, overwash. It's not necessarily a word that students may encounter in their daily lives. I know I don't. And it is also essential to understanding the text. And as a content-specific word that appears multiple times in this passage, it is important that teachers ensure students understand what this word means. In the next example, we have primary. Primary also has multiple meanings and in multiple content areas. So for example, math, there are primary numbers, and that has a very specific meaning compared to other uses of primary. So these are just 4 examples, 4 vocabulary words we pulled from the passage that illuminate the different criteria that Joe just illustrated. And so now I'll hand it back to Joe to talk about How-To Step 3.
Okay, thanks. So the third how-to step to help you address the recommendation is teach academic vocabulary in depth using multiple modalities, which is writing, speaking, and listening. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about elements of explicit vocabulary instruction, and these are research-based elements, okay? So let's talk about student-friendly definitions. Definitions in a traditional dictionary are very interesting. In fact, one of the researchers said that definitions in traditional dictionaries are good if you already know what the word means. Okay, so one of the reasons, and Isabel Beck brings this up in one of her books, that the reason why definitions in traditional dictionaries are so bad, believe it or not, is space restrictions. So you have a space restriction, so you have to use probably as few words as possible to get the point across, and the problem is they don't get the point across. And I'm going to make that clear to you in a second here. So they do not effectively convey the new concepts because they don't have room to do that. So let's talk about a denotation versus a connotation. So denotation is what's written in the dictionary, okay? But a connotation, this is the important part, it refers to the associations people make with a word or how it is typically used. So let's look at the word ally. Okay, one associated with another, that's the denotation, and this would be a definition in a traditional dictionary, okay? So the second one is a more student-friendly definition, and it gives you the connotation. So someone who helps you with what you're trying to do, especially when there are other people who are against you. So the first definition doesn't really explain why we use this word in our language. And a person, in the first definition, one associated with another could be your spouse, your partner. It could be Kirsten and I are associated with one another because she so kindly asked me to do this webinar, but she's not my ally, right? And I'll tell you why. Because when you have an ally, there's something going on. So let me give you an example. If I said that Jane was my colleague, that would mean that we might teach school together, we may team teach, we may teach the same grade. But if I said that Jane was my ally at work, you know there are problems at the school. Perhaps there are two groups, one in favor of something that has happened or is about to happen, and another group that isn't. So the people that are on, quote, my side are my allies. Okay, so you see the difference between one associated with another in that definition and the student-friendly definition that gives the context of the connotation of the word in the second definition. So what are student definitions? What do they contain? There are two elements. One is you want to characterize the word. So you're going to describe the word by focusing on specific aspects of its meaning rather than on a general description. So in ally, the first one was just very, very general, but the second one was specific and gave you that connotation, the specific aspects. So when you're looking or writing student-friendly definitions, and actually I have a source for you where you probably won't ever have to write one because you can just get them from the internet, but you want to ask yourself, why do we have this word particularly? These come from Isabel Beck. Why do we have the word connotation? Why do we have such a word? That's what you need to think about when you're trying to determine if you write a definition, if it's friendly, or if you see a definition in a textbook, a publisher's definition, many, many times they are not student-friendly. However, they are getting much, much better because folks like Isabel Beck and other vocabulary researchers are being asked to be consultants on textbooks, and they are pushing through this really research-based definitions and strategies for teaching vocabulary. So let's go on to just one more characteristic here, and you want to explain the meaning in everyday language. So the definition is crafted using word parts that are part of the student's vocabulary, and they convey the connotation of the meaning. And so we're going to do a little poll here. Here's one definition, and then if we go to the next, there are two definitions, and you're going to tell which one you think is student friendly. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, so if you are reluctant to do something, you do not want to do it and hesitate before doing it, or do it slowly and without enthusiasm. This is a student-friendly definition. So the first one, you were right, was not very good. This one is a good one. Okay, before we go on to we have one more. Before we go on to a vote in the next word, I want to talk just a little bit about this definition. This definition came from the Colville-Collins dictionary, which we can get online, and I have the website for you. So you might say that, well, this might be a little bit too hard of a definition for my students. One thing you can do is you can tweak these for your grade level and your students' level of English language development. So let's take the word hesitate. Okay, well, let's say, you know, my kids don't really know what hesitate means. Well, you can change that word to wait. Okay, you wait before doing something. And then another one might be enthusiasm. They may, you know, they don't know what enthusiasm means, so they're not going to know what reluctant means, or the connotation for reluctant. So you might want to change that to being excited about it. You do it slowly without being excited about it. And then as your students become familiar with reluctant, and they see it in the text, and you do activities with the word reluctant and things like that, you can go back to that definition if you like, and you could say, hey, you know, another word for wait, remember we talked about it means to wait because you really don't want to do it. Another word for wait is hesitate. So what you can do is you can build their vocabulary within the definition, but once they really understand what it means and had a lot of exposure to it, and you can do the same thing with the word enthusiasm. Okay, let's move on to arbitrary. You're going to tell me whether this is friendly or unfriendly. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at this. If you describe an action, rule, or decision as arbitrary, you think that it is not based on any principle, plan, or system. It often seems unfair because of this. Again, you can tweak this a little bit, and we've actually, in our research with English learners, we've had the teachers tweak the definitions. They would copy the definitions from the Collins-Colville, and then they would tweak it depending on their grade level. We've worked with first grade teachers, we've worked with 8th grade teachers, so you can do a little bit of tweaking so that the students can understand that.
So these are some resources that I think Joe was mentioning earlier. So you will never need to come up with your own student-friendly definitions because you have them all right here in the Longman Dictionary, Merriam-Webster's Learner's Dictionary, and the Collins-Colville Advanced Dictionary. So those are some resources. We will be sending out the materials after the webinar, so you will be able to have those links for your use then if you don't have time to write them down right now.
On that last slide, I just want to say that, and I should have put Collins-Colville on the top because that really is the best one. Longman and Merriam-Webster are good, but Collins-Colville is the best. So on our next slide, we're going to be talking about developing examples, non-examples, and concrete representations of words. So let's go to the next slide and talk about examples. And we have examples within the context of a selection, and we have examples beyond. So let's talk about within. Within the context, helps students to clarify and pinpoint the word's meaning. Whereas beyond, it assists the students in it kind of expands, and it tells them they can have a deeper understanding, because you don't want students to think that the word only means what was in the story. Let me give you an example. I'm going to use the word reluctant. And I don't know if you're familiar with this children's book. It's called Corduroy. And it's a story about the main character is, I believe it's a little boy, and he goes to the laundromat with his mother. And he brings his favorite toy, which is a bear named Corduroy. Well, mom finishes the laundry and everything, and it's time to leave, but he lost or can't find Corduroy. So the text reads that the child was reluctant to leave the laundromat without his toy. So an example within would be, this child really, didn't want to leave, because he didn't want to leave his toy there. But that's not only what reluctant means. That doesn't only mean that you're afraid to leave a place. So you want to give an example beyond the context so that the kids can understand that it could relate to other things. So, for example, this was classic. In Isabel's book, she has transcripts of classroom dialogue, and the word reluctant was one of the words, and a child said that he was reluctant to change his baby brother's diaper. And I thought, that's perfect. That it doesn't only mean that you're reluctant to leave someplace. So when you're teaching your vocabulary, you want to give a within and beyond. And so let's go to non-examples. The next slide. So non-examples, and another word for them are contrasting examples, okay? So they help pinpoint the meaning by actually you're telling the kid what the word isn't. I know it's terrible English, but you're telling them when it doesn't apply. So, and I'll give you an example in a second. So contrasting examples help solidify meanings. They prevent misconceptions because you're explicitly telling your students the attributes that are not part of the word's connotation. Okay, so let's look at the word enormous. Let's say that you're reading a book on dinosaurs. Okay, enormous. Dinosaurs are enormous, right? Okay, so that's an example within. An example beyond could be the redwood trees or the Rocky Mountains or something. Okay, a non-example would be an ant or a speck of dust. That's a non-example of something that is enormous. So it's not enormous. So it's really good to get those non-examples in there. Another thing, and the next slide is the concrete representations. And this includes pictures, diagrams, gestures, facial expressions. You could do a little skit with the kids or whatever. But what the purpose is to be able to make a connection between language, which is abstract, and something tangible, like a picture. And I have a quick story for you. I do a lot of observations, so I have a lot of stories. But I was in this one classroom in the LA area, and a young teacher, and you'll see why when I finish this example. And she was first grade teacher. She was teaching the word somersault. And yes, she did. She got down on her knees and she flipped a somersault in front of the class. Now, that's maybe a little extreme. I don't expect you all to be flipping somersaults for your kids, but do you think kids will ever forget what the word somersault means? So you want to get that concrete representation in there, and it doesn't have to be anything, that you have to spend a lot of time on. There's so much stuff on the internet, so many pictures on the internet that you can show. So anyway, you want to make sure that when you're teaching your words that you use those concrete representations. So the next slide is, I'm going to show you a video, but I want to kind of set you up a little bit before we show the video. This is a teacher pre-teaching a vocabulary word, and this takes place 6th, 7th, and 8th grade newcomer class. So it's middle school. This particular school district has a newcomer class, a class for students who have come to the United States and don't speak English. And so these teachers are phenomenal, and they can only stay there for about a year. They want to get them up to snuff so that they can, go into classes with students that have varying degrees of English language proficiency, but they need a little bit of help to get them going. I think it's a really good program. So if you look at the next slide there are 20 students in the class. They're all 100% English learners because it is a newcomer center. 90% have been in the U.S. less than a year, and most are at the beginning level of English proficiency, and 3 are at the intermediate level. 1 student speaks Mandarin, 1 student speaks Korean, and the remainder are Spanish speakers. And this segment was taped at the end of the school year. The next slide, here are some questions that, let's kind of go over them, and I'm not going to ask you to answer them, but you might want to, as you're watching this video, kind of think about the video as the questions as you're watching it. So the first one is, what's the goal of the lesson? And the next one is, what steps did the teacher take to reach the goal? And how was the lesson taught explicitly? And what, if any, feedback was provided to the students? So I do want to say that this is the first step in teaching a word. So I just said, 15 minutes ago, kids got to practice. They've got to practice. Kids have to talk if they're going to learn the language. And you're going to be noticing that the kids don't say much. The teacher's doing all the talking. And the reason is she's trying to get the point across of this word. Okay? Now, in subsequent tapes, which we can't see today, you will see how she takes this word and she incorporates activities to promote word learning, which I am going to talk about after the video. And that's when the kids do all the talking, and she just coaches them and, you know, works with them that way. So you're going to see a lot of teacher talk in this. So I think we're ready for the video.
The next word that we have is pattern. Everyone, pattern.
Pattern.
Okay, and pattern is a noun. Let me write it. Yes.
What's a pattern?
Ooh, good question. We're going to write down the definition of pattern. So we're going to write, it is a repeated, let's start with the word. Pattern is a repeated or regular way in which something is done. Okay, sorry for that. It's a little messy, but that's a P at the beginning. Pattern, that's the same word here. So there's a key word here. The key word is repeated. Something that repeats. Okay, something that is done over again, or that we see again. Okay, so I'm going to give you examples of pattern. Okay, for example, the American flag. You see the American flag up there? Mm-hmm. The American flag follows a pattern with the red and white stripes. Do you see that? Red, white, white. Mm-hmm, okay. We're looking at the stripes. See, this is a pattern because it is repeating. Red, white, white. So the stripes have a pattern that repeats. Another example, I'm looking at Ronnie, and his shirt has a pattern of stripes. Do you see that? Do you see Ronnie's shirt?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, my sweater too.
Your sweater has a pattern. That's right. That's the first thing I thought of when I saw you this morning. What is the pattern on your shirt?
Blue and red.
Blue.
Blue and red what? What do we call those lines? Stripes. Stripes, rayas, stripes. So your stripes are horizontal, and Ronnie's stripes are vertical. Okay. Here's another example of pattern. Okay. 2, 4, 6, 8. I'm counting by twos. Counting by twos is a pattern because I'm repeating the same thing. It's not the same number, but I'm adding 2 to each value. So that's a repeated pattern. So good, those are examples of patterns. Now I'm going to show you what is not a pattern. Does my clothing have a pattern?
No.
There's no pattern. No pattern. There's nothing. Okay. Let me see. If I drop my highlighters, I actually did drop one. If I drop all my highlighters and they scatter all over the place, there's no organization or anything on the way they fill. That is not a pattern because they're everywhere. They're scattered. No, it doesn't repeat, right? I'm not going to drop them because I don't want to have to pick them up. Let me see. Oh, every weekend I do something different. I like to try new things. That is not a pattern because it's different, right? It does not repeat, okay? It does not repeat, okay? Here's an example of not a something that is not a pattern. Is this a pattern?
No.
You don't know what number's coming next. We don't know what's repeating. This is not a pattern. Not a pattern. No pattern.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, what you just saw, the teacher you did a student-friendly definition, examples, non-examples of concrete representation. She was teaching that word explicitly.
Rebecca, let me start this lesson by asking you a question.
Excuse me, guys. Hold on one moment. That should have stopped and didn't. All right. I think we're back in business.
Oh, good. Okay. So the next step after that, and these videos are on the IES website, and I could explain that toward the end when we're doing questions and stuff. But the next video in this series is the same teacher showing activities to promote word learning, which I'm going to talk about right now. So let's go on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about the levels of processing. The first one is the easiest, and as you go up these levels, the cognitive demand becomes harder. So the first one is called associational, and basically the student connects. It's like connecting a definition to a word, doing which would be matching exercises, or here we are.
Thank you, Betsy.
Crossword puzzles, things like that. They're very, very low level. It's basically rote memorization. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about the next level, which is the comprehension level. And students use definitional information to complete activities such as classifying words into categories or completing graphic organizers. So as you can see, this is just a little bit harder, and so some examples would be, and you may have used some of these, a semantic map or a semantic feature analysis or a Freyer model or a concept diagram or a Venn diagram. Okay, so the next level, this is the hardest level, and it's called the generative level. And we're going to talk about these the most because these are the ones that really put the pedal to the metal and whether your kids really understand what the word means. So in the generative level, students produce novel responses to a word, and examples would be responding to questions, making choices, creating examples. So this level of cognitive processing involves thinking at the highest level of difficulty of word meaning. So students need to use the information they've learned about the word to develop or construct meaning and give unique and inventive responses to the questions about words. So let's go to the next page. I've got a couple slides that I'll give you an example of what these are. So idea completion, these are adapted from Isabel Beck, as you can see on the screen there. And actually, there's a 2012 or 2013 second edition of this book. Given a scenario, students provide a rationale to demonstrate their understanding of a word's meaning. So your target word in the first one is forbidden. The small child was forbidden to play with matches because. So the child has to finish that and explain why, which will give you an idea of whether the child understands the word, what the word forbidden means. Now, one of the things you can do with these activities is, as I mentioned before, is you can have your students work together, put them in pairs. And when you do your pairs, of course, you're going to have one student who has a higher level of English proficiency than the other, so he or she can help the other student. And so what you do is you put them in pairs or triads, and they work together and talk about this first one. Why would a child be forbidden to play with matches? Okay. Then you call the class together and you do a debrief and you ask for responses. This will give a student who is reluctant, there we go, reluctant again. A student is reluctant to speak because, English isn't their first language and they may be, self-conscious. It'll give them more impetus to speak because they've had a chance with their partner to practice. Okay, so you can do it that way. You can give it as homework. I think some of these might be really difficult for kids to write all the information down that they could maybe easily say. You're the teacher. It's your judgment on how you want to do it. Older children might be better able to write responses to these. Another one, would you want a frail person on your football team? Why or why not? You're going to notice that in all of these, you need to have students justify their answers. So if a child says yes or no to this question and you don't go on to the next kid, you ask them, well, why or why not? So if let's say a child says, and I should say this, if a child justifies the answer is right. So if a child says, yeah, I would like a frail person on my football team because a frail person gets hurt easily and bones break easily and probably isn't really going to be too much into playing the game, and that would make me look like a better football player. Now, granted, a very narcissistic response, but it is not wrong. Okay, so you want to make sure that when they're responding and they're giving you their justifications, you want to make sure that it isn't one that you think is the right answer, because everybody would think, no, I don't want a frail person on my team. Okay, but this person wants a frail person, but they explained why they do. So let's go to the next slide. These are questions reasoned as examples. Students interact with target words by responding to questions and giving examples. So here, why is it good to contemplate, that's your target word, the possible consequences for your behavior? So they would have to discuss that. And the next slide, we're using what we call a word line. So what you're going to do is you have this kind of word line, it's like a number line, and the word endurance is your target word. And so you'll see down here, how much endurance does it take to, number one, participate in a decathlon? So, I would think that it would take a lot of endurance. So the child will take the number one and place it, probably right next to that box that says great deal of endurance. And then what are you going to do? You're not going to say, okay, thank you. You're going to say, okay, why did you put that there? And then the child has to explain why. Okay. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about, this is actually How-To Step 4. This is the first part of How-To Step 4, and it's teaching word learning strategies to help students independently figure out the meaning of words. So the first way, of course, is context clues. So in this one here, we're going to talk about context clues, and we're going to talk about word parts. So context clues help students derive definitions by using the surrounding context. Now, I want to warn you that there are some words that they're called non-directive words that the context isn't going to help you. So no matter what you do, you got to know the meaning of the word, or you have to teach that word. So when you're working on the strategy I'm going to show you for context clues, you want to make sure that the word can be figured out by the strategy and by the context around the word. So let's go to the next slide and look at the strategy. You're going to read the sentence with the unknown word, and then determine, is there anything in that sentence that's going to help define the word? It's going to help to tell you what the word means. If not, then you're going to read a few sentences before and a few sentences after, and you're going to look for information that's going to help you. So let's go to the next slide. How are we going to teach this? So we're going to teach this using scaffolded instruction, and we start off with modeling with think alouds. So you're going to take each one of those steps, and you're going to implement them, and you're going to tell the student what you're thinking. And teachers have told me, I go all over the country teaching think alouds and how to think aloud, particularly in reading comprehension. And they say, well, I really feel funny, talking and, thinking aloud. I feel self-conscious. But I mean, your kids love you. They're, don't feel self-conscious. But this is the way that you're going to model a strategy, is by thinking aloud for them. And so you're going to model a couple, 3 times, not just once. We recommend 3 times. And then you're going to go into the guided practice phase, or the we call teacher-assisted phase, or guided practice phase. And you're going to do it with them. Okay. You've heard that I do, we do, you do. This would be the we do, where we do it together, and I give you prompts as we're going through that strategy. And then in independent practice, of course, they do it by themselves. The next slide, we're going to talk about word parts, which would be prefix, suffixes, and root words. So you're going to teach the strategy the same way you taught context clues. You're going to model with think alouds. You're going to guided practice, and you're going to independent practice. And the next few slides, it's an actual think aloud that's written out, so you can see what a think aloud looks like in this area. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to be thinking aloud, and the word is unreachable. And so you're going to say to the kids, I'm going to break up the word to see if I can find the root words. That's the first thing you're going to do. So remember, you're talking out loud. I know it seems funny, but just go with it. We learned that un is a prefix, and we learned that able is a suffix. So reach must be the root word. Now remember, you will have had to taught what prefixes and suffixes before doing this, of course. Okay, next slide. So now we've identified what the root word is. So we're going to say reach means to move your hand or arm to try to grab or touch something. So you might, want to try to reach up on a shelf just to give them a little concrete representation. I'm assuming they know what reach means. If not, I guess you have to teach what it means. And then we learned un means not, and we learned able means that you can do something. So let's go on to the next slide. So let's look at each part of unreachable to figure out its meaning. Reach means to move your hand or arm to try to touch or grab something. Able means you can do something. So reachable means you can touch or grab something. And in the next slide, adding the prefix un, which means not, changes the word's meaning to not being able to touch or grab something. So unreachable means not being able to touch or grab something. So you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but just imagine what your kids are learning by hearing you think aloud. And then you can do another example or so, and then do one together and use this strategy. Okay, Erin, you're up.
All right, thanks, Joe. So we learned that recommendation 1 is to teach a set of vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities, and Joe did a fantastic job of explaining those. And so I'd like to open it now to any questions that you might have about what we've discussed so far. And if you are a teacher in the Pacific region, if you have any ideas or comments about how you can apply this recommendation to your context. So if you could just use the group chat feature there, we'll read out the questions that appear. So yeah, let's open it up for discussion. And as you are typing, again, an example was selecting passages that are culturally relevant and engaging to students, like the example we showed. So do you think this is something that's realistic for the specific context that you're teaching in, or anything like that?
I think we can go ahead and move forward. And again, if you have any questions or if you have any thoughts about this as we move forward throughout the remainder of the presentation, please feel free to send a note through that group chat, and we will try to answer any questions or talk about any recommendation, or I'm sorry, any personal experiences around the recommendation toward the end of the webinar. So I think we can move to the next slide.
Yeah, recommendation 2. And that talks about integrating oral and written English language into content area teaching. So we're going to go to the next slide, which is how to step 1. Strategically use instructional tools such as short videos, visuals, and graphic organizers to anchor instruction and help students make sense of the content. So on the next slide, we have just some advantages of these instructional tools. So your video clips and your visuals, they will engage the students, particularly videos, as you know, and they're going to prepare your students for the lesson by providing background knowledge. Now, if you take, let's take Erin's example, that really good example about global warming. If you showed a short video clip about global warming, just to give them some background knowledge, kind of pique their interest, kind of give them, as you can see in that third bullet, raises issues or articulates themes that are going to be addressed when they read and go through this lesson. And also it provides students with a common experience that stimulates discussion. Because remember, students, no matter what topic you're talking about, students will have varying degrees of background knowledge. So you're kind of putting the kids on at least you know as a teacher, if you will say, show this video, you know what they all know from the video. So you can at least go from there when you're teaching. So let's go on. So Erin, yes, Erin, you're going to talk about using that passage to anchor instruction and some of the strategies to use.
Yeah, absolutely. So before showing the video, let's say the passage I shared, the article that it comes from does have a very short video, but if you were showing a different video that still covered some of the same sort of ideas, it's important to select and pre-teach vocabulary words before showing the video to, again, help prepare students with any unfamiliar words they might encounter or to build that background knowledge. So let's say you had this video and we would select the following words: uninhabitable, impact, aquifer, infrastructure, primary, and contaminant. So we would go over that with the students before showing the video. In the next slide, we would also, before showing the video, we'd want to review the questions that students would answer after watching the video. So this encourages them to be active learners while watching the video, as well as guiding their viewing of the video, trying to get them to pay attention to certain things so that they could not only answer those questions after seeing it, but they would be able to focus their attention on certain aspects you're trying to teach. So the questions we chose for this video based on the passage are describing what a current atoll island looks like today, what it might look like 50 years from now, and then asking how the rising sea levels will impact the islands and their water supply. So the next slide, I think that's going back to you, Joe.
Okay, so again, putting them in pairs, as I mentioned before, with the levels of different levels of English language development, and they discuss the responses with their partner, that rehearsal thing we talked about. Now, number two, if your kids can do it, you can have them write responses based on their discussion, but you can skip number two, and you can what number three is really, they're rehearsing what they're doing in number one is they're discussing the responses. They're really rehearsing it as was addressed in number three. And so they're preparing for the class discussion. And then when you have your class discussion, your students be more likely to share because they feel more comfortable. So the step two there is really, it depends on your grade level. It depends on the student's level of English language development. So that's where your teacher judgment comes in. Let's see, the next one is the graphic organizers. I'm going to go over this, and then Erin's going to, you're going to show them a graphic organizer, well, coming up. So the graphic organizer helps students to organize their thinking. So it's, you know what, it's kind of like it's a visual of what the text is saying. Okay, so it makes patterns. Remember I talked about relationships, that a lot of times textbooks don't make those relationships. Well, a graphic organizer is going to help make those relationships clearer, because they're not only going to read it in the graphic organizer, but going to see it in the graphic organizer. And that will make the content more comprehensible. And it also serves as a source for writing and speaking activities. And you can, in the practice guide, it talks about how you would provide a graphic organizer. And then there are also activities where once a student just feels comfortable with a particular graphic organizer, that maybe you can partially fill one out, and then after you go through your lesson and everything, they can complete it. So you can use graphic organizers for pre-reading, you can do it during reading, you could do it post-reading. So they're very adaptable. And also, if you go online, as you know, you can find so many graphic organizers, and honestly, don't pay for anything, because there's a lot of free stuff out there that you can use and download and stuff like that. So go to the internet and see what you can find. Okay, next slide.
So yes, we made a graphic organizer, a Venn diagram for the passage on the atoll islands and the impact of climate change. So just as Joe mentioned, this helps organizes the students' thinking and relating the different impacts, relationships between the text, the facts, and the concepts that the passage is trying to show. And since this passage is talking about the effects of climate change in the future, this specific Venn diagram helps students organize their thinking about what the islands look like today, what they might look like in the future according to this passage, and then what similarities bind them together. So as you can see, we see how concerns for rising sea levels today could lead to consistent overwash flooding in the future, as well as how outmigration will change the populations for the different island nations. So again, this is a very concrete way to get students thinking about the different connections specific to this particular passage. And so, Joe, let's wrap up recommendation 2.
Okay, great. So just a couple more slides. So how-to step 2 is to explicitly teach content-specific academic vocabulary and general academic vocabulary. So this is just a quick review of what I've talked about, the tiers. So let's go to the next slide. And so this is domain or content-specific academic vocabulary. These are tier 3 words that I mentioned and Aaron mentioned. They're unique to a particular academic discipline. So examples from math would be the commutative property, prime numbers, and pi. If you're taking an auto mechanics class, which we all need, carburetor would be a tier 3 word. It is domain specific. Okay, then the next slide, we're just going to quickly review tier 2 words. These are general academic vocabulary, and they goes across academic disciplines, and they often need to be taught to help students understand. This is interesting. If you look in the practice guide, there's an example of how you have to teach some general academic vocabulary to understand the meaning of a domain-specific vocabulary, and the example in the practice guide is photosynthesis. So I hope you read the guide and pay attention to that section, because it's really interesting. Because, I mean, you could have a great definition of photosynthesis, but if there's some words in there that the kids don't understand, you may have to teach those first. So some examples, again, of general would be environment, factor, investigate, and primary. Okay.
We are going to discuss recommendation 2, which again is to integrate oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. So does anyone have any questions or perhaps ideas about how we can apply this recommendation to the specific context you're in? Again, you can use the group chat feature and type up your questions. So any thoughts on this?
It looks like we do have a question for Joe. And I'll just go ahead and read that out, and then Joe, if you'll jump in. It's often the case in many Pacific Islands that teachers are second language English speakers who come from other countries to teach English in the islands where English is not the dominant community language. Therefore, English becomes the de facto lingua franca of the classroom between teachers and students. Do you have any suggestions for these teachers about the way they should approach the practice guide?
That's a good question. I think, well, first of all, you want to read the practice guide, but I think I have observed and worked with teachers whose primary language is not English in our schools, and what I always talk to them about is to be prepared. Let me give you an example. I had one teacher who was giving wrong information, and so I had to talk to her about that. So I think the thing is, look at what's in the practice guide and make sure that when you're going to implement these, that you prepare and make sure that the information you're giving the students is accurate. That's a tough question, and it's a tough issue.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? Any follow-up questions? So it doesn't look like there are any other questions. Any thoughts on next steps? But all of you do have my email address, and we definitely welcome any feedback after the fact, or if you decide, if you have questions that you'd like for us to share with Dr. Domino, we'd be happy to do so. We do have a stakeholder feedback survey that we would like to ask you to complete, but unfortunately, since I've been having technical issues, I don't know that I'm able to pull up that link right now. I will send that out to each of you shortly, and we ask you to complete that for us. It's part of our reporting requirements, but more important than that, it's really a way for us to learn, what you liked about the webinar. Certainly, anything you didn't like, anything we can improve on, we would love to hear about that from you. And if you have any ideas about what you'd like to see next. So look for an email from me in the next day or so. Other than that, if there are no other questions, we can go ahead and close this one out. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.